بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome, brothers and sisters, to the complete character of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So firstly, let's start off with a Quran recitation, inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وما خلقنا السماوات والأرض وما بينهما إلا بالحق وإن الساعة لآتية فاصفح الصفح الجميل إن ربك هو الخلاق العليم ولقد آتيناك سبعا من المثاني والقرآن العظيم لا تمدن عينيك إلى ما متعنا به أزواجا منهم ولا تحزن عليهم واخفض جناحك للمؤمنين وقل إني أنا النذير المبين كما أنزلنا على المقتسمين الذين جعلوا القرآن عضين فوربك لنسألنهم أجمعين عما كانوا يعملون فاصدع بما تؤمر وأعرض عن المشركين إنا كفيناك المستهزئين الذين يجعلون مع الله إلها آخر فسوف يعلمون ولقد نعلم أنك يضيق صدرك بما يقولون فسبح بحمد ربك وكن من الساجدين واعبد ربك حتى يأتيك اليقين صدق الله العظيم.
Barakallahu feekum, jazakallahu khairan for the beautiful recitation. So a huge welcome to our guest speaker, Muhammad Hijab, who is, as many of you know, a debater and public speaker on many topics. So he has also taught many courses on humanities and languages and has ijazat in Islamic sources. Muhammad Hijab is also a QM alumni and has a degree in politics and masters in history, and is currently doing his postgraduate on Islamic studies at SOAS. So before we dive into the questions, I'm going to pass over to Muhammad Hijab for a few minutes. Give a quick opening, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to all the people in the university I used to go to. I mean, I got great memories there in Queen Mary. You know, done my undergraduate there. I'm not sure if you guys can see me, by the way. I'll put a torch on my face so that you guys can see the nur.
Yeah, we can see you.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, so I've been in Queen Mary for some time, and yeah, I had some good memories there. And I just want to start off by saying that you guys are quite fortunate to be in an environment in East London where the population of Muslims is as it is. And you've got one of the biggest masjids in Europe, if not, I think the biggest masjid in Europe, in the East London Mosque, right at your doorstep. You've also got Imam Jazari Institute, which I'm sure many of you know what that is. But it's an institute which kind of helps with Quranic studies. So if you want to memorize the Quran, like the brother who was reading, mashallah, in a very proficient way before handing me over, you know, you can go to the Imam Jazari Institute, and you should try and make as much use of the resources that you have in your area. That's the first piece of advice I want to give everyone. And also to be careful. I mean, I was one of you in the sense that I know the kind of fitan that can happen in the university setting. And one of the biggest, if not the biggest, that I found was, you know, before getting married, you know, intermingling with the opposite gender, opposite sex. And obviously the fitna that I'm sure many of you have experienced, maybe directly or indirectly, or the cycle of, you know, not being muttaqi, not having the proper taqwa, that you get yourself into. And so I really think that this is, if it's a thing that you guys prioritize in terms of getting it right, that there can be facade and corruption that is inverted. So just bear that in mind. Bear that in mind, that really these are the formative years. These are the important years where, if you make the wrong kind of decisions in your life at this time and you do the wrong kind of thing, then it's not a good place to start your careers, and it's not a good place to start your adulthood. So just a friendly nasiha really from me, because once again I've was in your very shoes to you guys, is that just keep as much away from all these fitan as possible, and try and make as much use of the Islamic resources, whether it's from the ISOC or from Ibn Jazari Institute or in the East London Mosque or wherever it may be, that you can. I wanted to, instead of doing it lecture style, what I wanted to do, guys, is I wanted to have a conversation with you and allow you guys to ask me questions, not only just questions relating to shubuhat or misconceptions of the religion of Islam, though I do welcome those as well, but questions relating to like practical advice, like maybe if you guys are facing something in the university, from someone who's kind of doesn't have too much of a distant memory of that experience. So I'm happy to take questions at this point and bear those two things in mind. Jazakumullah khair.
Barakallahu feek, barakallahu feek. So to start off, our first question is, could you just mention a bit about the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and his greatest qualities for those who might not be familiar with him?
I think it's a good question. I mean, the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam had impeccable character. Before I talk about the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, it's actually something that Umar ibn Khattab said and was asked. And I really feel like this is so relevant. He was asked by Ibn Abbas, and this is an athar which is narrated authentically, right? And Ibn Abbas asked him, what are the qualities of leadership? What are the qualities of leadership? So Umar ibn Khattab, he replied, he says, Wallahi la yahmilu hadha al-amr illa al-layyin fi ghayri da'af. He says that no one will be able to handle a position of leadership except for the one who is lenient and other than weakness. وَالْقَوِيُّ فِي غَيْرِ عُنْفٍ, and the one who is strong in other than being overly aggressive. Unf is like over-aggression. He says, وَالْمُمْسِكْ فِي غَيْرِ بُخْلٍ, and the one who is mumsik literally means to hold something back. So in this case, the one who's a smart planner in terms of finances, but he's not stingy. Bukhl is stinginess. So he's not miser, he's not a stingy person. And the last quality was Jawad fi ghayri israf, the one who is generous but is not extravagant. Now, these four qualities I think are very important, because virtue, I mean, there's a whole kind of sub-philosophical field called virtue ethics. Virtue is a very difficult thing to come by, okay? Virtue is really when you possess the balance of certain traits which would otherwise give you a negative byproduct. For example, if you're usually confident, people are arrogant as well. It's a very difficult thing to get someone who's very, very confident, but is also very, very humble. Okay, and this is where I want to start, because think about the seerah of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Think about the biography of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Really think about how you would describe him, right? And how others have described him. He was the man who went to the mountains and made public announcements in front of his whole city. No one could accuse him, of cowardice or of shyness in a good sense, of course, but in that of cowardice or of not being able, because he'd done lots of confident things. He'd do public speeches, he'd come out, he'd do physical things like war. He had, and this is usually used as a point against the Prophet, but I see this as a great point for him. The fact that, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, he mentions he had 19 ghazawat, which is, if you think about ghazawat is like expeditions, military expedition. If you think about that, that's an average of 2 a year. That's an average. If you talk about the Medina period, that's an average of 2 encounters where you are putting yourself in the front lines in the battlefield and where your life can be lost. There's an average of 2 of those every year, and so he can never be accused of being a coward, and he can never be accused of being someone who didn't have confidence. But at the same time, if you look at his interactions with his wives, and if you look at his interactions with the companions, you can never accuse him of being arrogant. I mean, even to be honest, even now, of all of that's being said about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, even now, arrogance is not usually a point people even make now. Yani. It's not even, they say he was violent, yes, but they don't say he was arrogant. Think about that. Even the most vehement of critics at his time didn't say he was a mutakabbir. The people who knew it, no one could say he was an arrogant person. And no one could say he was a coward. So everyone knew, if you're not arrogant and you're not a coward, then what are you? You must be a confident person. He was stridently confident. He was virtuously confident, but he was also virtuously humble and virtuously shy. You see? So he met that Goldilocks zone on all of the key points where a human being would want to have. Because once again, if you're very humble, people can take humility for weakness very easily. And I'm sure many of you that are listening to this have experience with that. People take humility and kindness for weakness as a standard because they see that there's someone who is humbling themselves, right? And who is speaking in a soft tone and who is being nice, that they can exploit that individual. And usually those people, quite frankly, are exploited. You know, unfortunately, people who have kindness and humility, but at the same time, they don't have that confidence. But the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, no one can accuse him of falling short in either of those domains. And that's why the beauty about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's character is that if you really think about it, he meets the Goldilocks zone, beautiful balance, virtue ethics type standard for everything you'd want him to meet, or everything you'd want for yourself. And so imagine now, if you wanted to follow someone, who would you follow? A celebrity, an actor, maybe an intellectual? Who would you want to follow but someone who has perfected all of their ethical virtues and has done so at such a beautiful way? And that's why the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his wife said, kana khuluqul Quran, that his khuluq, his etiquettes were the Quran. Yani that if you look at the Quran and its narrative and how it balances between at-targhib wa tarhib, which is basically incentivizing and disincentivizing through fear, but incentivizing through hope, through its descriptions of heaven and hell, where what you call the eschatological realm is put at the center of the Quranic picture, where it emphasizes death, and it emphasizes it's very serious, but at the same time it's a hopeful book. All of those things are represented in the very character of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, just like Aisha said, radiallahu anha, like she said, and his khuluq were the Quran, his etiquettes were the Quran. In other words, the Quranic is represented in the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's character. So if I wanted to make this very brief, I would say that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the reason why we should love him so much and praise him so much as well, is because not only just what he's been through and what you can empathize when he went to Ta'if and he was harassed and they threw things at him and they tried to abuse him. And he continued, or not just because of his influence or his determination, or because of the fact he was a family man. Quite frankly, I was just talking to my friends yesterday about this. I was, I had a discussion with a couple of friends of mine, and I was saying it's shocking to think that the Prophet Muhammad, we just said that, he had 2 military expeditions as standard every year, putting your life on the line, but also that he was a qadi and that he had to lead the prayers. He was the judge. People came to him from everywhere to judge between them. Even non-Muslims came to him to do that. And he did all of that, and he had 9 wives at one time. Now, once again, this is usually used against us. Say, how could the Prophet, he's such a depraved man that he would want 9 wives at one time? How is that depravity? You have 9 relationships which you're trying to sustain at the same time. Depravity is when sexual depravity is when you go to a woman or a man, if you're a woman, right? Or you go to people and you use them, exploit them sexually, and you give them no return, no time, no energy investment, nothing. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he married 9. He had all of in his lifetime, more than 9. But at one time, he had 9 wives. Now, you're going to find out, for most of you, you're not married yet. You guys are going to find out how difficult marriage is. Like, one husband, or sorry, one wife is very, very difficult to maintain, in a sense that, you've got the emotional baggage, you've got her extended family, you've got to speak to them, you've got to, you're still working on each other, you have to show each other your red lines. All of that but you have that with 9 of them, and you're going to fight for your life, and you're going to be the judge, and you're going to be the spiritual and religious leader, and you're doing that all in like 10 years, in the Medinan period. That's quite shocking, actually, if you think about that. It really is quite shocking. So when you think about all of those things, and the seerah will connect you to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that's why I would just want to end by saying, if you don't have already, pick up a nice book of seerah. I recommend in English a book called The Sealed Nectar. It's called The Sealed Nectar. Just pick up the book and read a little bit every day. Read a little bit every day. There's 2 things that you want to be grounded on in university and beyond. You want to be grounded on the Quran, like you want to have a good understanding of what Allah is communicating to you, a good understanding of the meanings of the Quran. And the other thing you really need to be grounded on is the life of the Prophet and, his seerah, his biography. And so as I say, the recommendation here is for a book like The Sealed Nectar. That would be very good. And consider what I've said, because I might have said it in like 5 or 10 minutes, but believe me, when you ponder and consider those things properly, you really will see the value of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Jazakumullah khair.
Barakallahu feek. So, mashallah, tabarakallah, there are some non-Muslims in the audience. So how do you know that these narrations, which you said, are actually authentic?
Okay, so the question of narrations, and how do we know any narration is authentic in the first place? So there is a systemized method of what you call Hadith Criticism, okay, which basically sifts out weak narrations, inauthentic narrations from the authentic ones. And basically, if you wanted to make this as brief as possible, a narration has to fulfill 5 conditions in order for it to be considered as authentic. So the 5 conditions are that it has to be muttasil, number 1, right? So it has to be something which is connected back to the Prophet. So in other words, the source cannot come from someone who has not met the Prophet, or someone who has not met someone who has met the Prophet. So in other words, the source must go back directly to the Prophet. So most hadith traditions go back to one of the companions of the Prophet, one of the family members of the Prophet, one of the wives of the Prophet. Like Aisha, Aisha's the wife of the Prophet. She has many, one of the most narrations attributed to her. So the second thing is that it cannot be ma'lul. Now, the illah is a defect. And this is a very big topic, by the way. Like, if there's a defect in the chain of narration, if there's a defect in the chain and or even the text. So if the text seems to be going against something which is very easily established in the religion, then once again there will be question marks added to that. So it has to be muttasil. It has to have. It cannot be have illah, and it cannot be shadh. A shadh literally means anomalous. So something which is anomalous is something which goes against either the majority of other narrations which point to somewhere else, or even one narration which has a more authentic strand. So for example, if you have somebody who's met the Prophet and he says something about the Prophet, and then somebody else who has not met the Prophet, I'm just simplifying it here, who says something which contradicts what that person A said. So this narration would be seen as anomalous because it's going against that which is established from a higher authority. So that is a massive, there's, especially with what you call ilal, defects, there's voluminous kind of hadith tracts and books and all these kinds of things which are dedicated to this very notion. Then the person themselves that is narrating, or every single person that is narrating the hadith must be adl. In other words, they must be just. And there's 9 conditions for justice, which we're not going to kind of talk about now. But basically, they can't have what you call a criminal record, if you want to put it in modern parlance. And connected to that is basically are the biographies of men. It's called Ilmu Rijal. So the biographies, we have biographies, it's not just men, by the way, it's women as well, of course, yeah? But they just called it that for some reason. So Ilmu Rijal, or the biographies of the companions and the tabi'een and so on, and those individuals, we have those biographies. So for example, a book like Sir A'lam Nubala by Dhahabi, we have those narrations, those biographies of individuals. We see if they have what is their record? Are they a biased person? Is it conceivable that they may be trying to invent something about the Prophet or for a monetary reason. And that is really a historical approach. I mean, I studied history as a postgraduate. Was one of my postgraduates when I was in Queen Mary. And these are just kind of things you kind of go through in terms of even Western historical approaches. Does the person have a motive? Have they done it before? Have they fabricated things before? And the last thing is they have to have good dabt. Dabt really is the ability to memorize and or write properly. So imagine if you've got an illiterate person and the person is known to be illiterate, but then he's got a book of references. So that book of references will be rejected. It says it's not you that wrote it, you see. Or if the person doesn't know how to write well, he might not be illiterate or she might not be illiterate, but the person is not very proficient in that field. So that individual will then be discarded, and the narration will be discarded as well, because it will be seen as weak. So, and you know, even in terms of authenticity, there's gradations. It's not all at one level. So we don't just deem it authentic. Oh, it's not us, but the muhaddithin, the scholars of specialism of hadith, they don't just deem something as authentic or not. They will grade it as, okay, the highest level is what they refer to as mutawatir, which literally means that it's attested by a multiplicity of sources. Then you have something like mashhur, which is 3 or more sources, aziz, which is 2 or more sources, gharib, which is 1 source, and so on. So and then you have other kinds of gradations, like you have mutawatir. This is talking about the sanad, but then the chain of narration. But you have another aspect, which is this hadith sahih? Is it hasan or hasan li ghayrihi? Meaning, is it authentic to the highest degree, or is it somewhat of, it's okay? They literally say it's kind of good, but it's not to the highest level. Or hasan li ghayrihi is authentic because of another narration which strengthens it. So basically, I don't want to kind of take so much time with this, but the long story is there is a very rigorous science employed to authenticating hadiths, and this has so many scholars working on it for 1,400 years that usually when there's a consensus on the strength and the veracity of hadith, and everyone agrees to that, there's usually real good reason for that agreement.
Barakallahu feek. So the next question is, can you explain the marriage of Aisha to such a young age and at such a young age, and how something like that could be okay?
Yeah, so people, I mean, obviously the narration says that she was 9 when the consummation took place. And obviously in modern day, you think, how is that possible that a 9-year-old can even feasibly be ready for marriage? Well, this is the ancient reality, quite frankly. This is the ancient reality. And we're not saying that everything ancient should be implemented in the modern world, because quite frankly, the social structures that are in place or were in place in the ancient world are not always in place in the modern world. And that's not me saying that despite the hadith, that's me saying that because of other hadiths and other traditions. So for example, now if someone says, can we implement this now? We say no, because quite frankly, the reality was much different back then. And there's usually 2 things which need to be fulfilled in order for anything to take place. One of them is, actually, let's stick with one of them, which is qudra, which is the ability. And that can be subdivided into 2 things. So qudra, or ability, can be mental and it can be physical. Now, I want to submit to you guys that if you go into year 6 or year 7 classroom or whatever it may be, people at that age, because they haven't been, held into the thrust of life, are not going to be ready to take on, adult life. But back in the days, I mean, if you go back to ancient Sparta, for example, or Athens, 5 and 6-year-olds, were being trained to fight, and with proper swords and so on. And by the age of 12, they'd be out in the battlefield. We can't say that we can't say, and this is what Clifford Geertz referred to as the thick description. We can't say that the 2 kind of generations or the time periods are the same. Anyone who's a beginner student of kind of history or sociology will be aware of that. And so obviously now, we're not going to say we're going to implement that. And that is the case with a lot of rules in Islam. There's a lot of rules which are unimplementable in the modern world. And once again, that's not despite the tradition, it's because of it. Because we have something called usul, or we have something called qawaid, principles. Yeah, qaida is literally a principle. So a dawabit are these kinds of things. And qawaid and dawabit are more, they are more authoritative than individual pieces of legislation, in the sense that, and this is what Shatibi says. He says one of the major, medieval Muslim scholars, he says that principles of Islam are more powerful than individual pieces of evidence from Quran and Sunnah because they're composed of so many of those pieces of evidence together. So a dabit or a qaida, like for example, ad-darar yuzal is one of the qawaids. That harm is to be averted. That is one of the qawaid of Islam. It's not just a liberal principle, it's actually an Islamic one as well. For the most part, and this we're talking about a war context, yeah, that's usually the only exception. The idea is ad-dararu yuzal. That is a qaida in Islam, which means a principle that harm is to be averted. So nowadays, quite frankly, we don't just look at puberty as the benchmark for when a woman is ready to get married. We don't look at that. We look at, or a man even, or a young man or a young woman. We look at all of the factors, social factors, which enable a person to be able to fulfill their obligations in a correct way, and also not to be harmed. So yeah, I mean, to be quite frank, there's lots of things you look at in the past and you'll think, how could that happen? But this is the study of history. Remember, we're talking about Islam 1,400 years ago, 1,400 years. I mean, quite frankly, 100 years ago in this country, 100 years. Yeah, the Marriage Act was not in place because the Marriage Act came in 1929, I think. Yeah, 1929 was the Marriage Act. 1929. I mean, that's less than 100 years ago. That's about 90 years ago. And you could get married to 12-year-olds in this country. Only in 1929, I believe, that's when they really changed the rules. And in America, you had states up until the early 20th century, like Delaware, where you were allowed to get married to 7-year-olds and 8-year-olds. I mean, we have to remember when we're talking about history, we are living in a very peculiar age where a lot of sudden developments took place, and those developments were not there. The whole world did not see it as a strange thing for people to kind of be in relationships with 12 and 13-year-olds or 10-year-olds or 9-year-olds, depending on what age we're talking about. It's only really become as it is because of the education system. Because if you look at the West, the UK in particular, why did they decide after World War I? Because World War I ended, as you guys know, 1918. So after like 10 years after that, the Liberal government decided, it was a Liberal government at the time, they decided to put in something called the Marriage Act. So why did they decide that? They decided that because it's clearly they're trying to use education as a way to try and rebuild the economy because there had been infrastructural damage. So they wanted to rebuild the economy. They wanted to rebuild everything. So they said, you know what we're going to do? We're gonna bring education at the forefront of our plan. That's why they made education up until 16 compulsory. It wasn't always the case. I mean, if you just look at the Industrial Revolution, like 150 years ago, whenever it was, you guys know the stories. You probably went through it in history that 8-year-olds and 9-year-olds were working in all these factories and all that kind of stuff. The Victorian era and all that. It's only quite recent, after World War I, they decided and why this is relevant is because basically adulthood started to be connected to the age you finish education. So the age you finish education was 16. Is that a coincidence that it's also the age of consent for having sex? It's not a coincidence, because basically they don't want the age of consent has regularly been tied to when a person finishes education, because the idea is, and this is probably what these parliamentarians actually thought and sat and thought about in the UK. They said, and I know you can get the Hansard records if you want. I mean, it will be interesting for someone in the audience listening to this could go and look at the Hansard records and actually see before the Marriage Act what kind of discussions were being had. Obviously, there was a feminist influence as well. The first wave feminists were influential, from what I remember. But what kind of discussions were being had? Because this was actually a very big change in not only morality, like it was a big change in law and morality at the same time. This idea of the age of consent being 16, for example. Anyway, so this age of consent being 16 is always tied to when the person's educated now, because the idea is now that they finish education, they can make informed, autonomous decisions. But ancient societies, and even those which are like not even that ancient, quite frankly, they didn't have this idea. They had the idea that, well, when the individual was able to be independent and make money for themselves, they could do it, and that was a much lower age. So when people ask this question, it just really, for me, it just shows their kind of, a good historian basically wouldn't ask this question. Really, honestly, a good historian would not. There's no way. I've never seen professional historian asked that question, they all know the answer. The answer is because there was nothing seen to be wrong with that at that time. Even Jordan Peterson, I listened to him recently. There's a video of him. Someone asked him about that, about Aisha in particular. They asked him about, oh, Aisha, he had a child bride, Muhammad had a child bride. He said, no, that can be seen as something which is, you know, normal at that time. So he just brushed it off. Most intellectuals know that this is something which is very regular. We're not trying to, here's the thing, we're not trying to be revolutionaries, if you like, and try and say, well, we want young people to be married, because we know that they can't handle it. We know that the societal structures are different now. And so in some, therefore, the question is only problematic in the minds of very modern men. Like, obviously, I mean the word men here, you know, figuratively, if you like. But it's not really problematic if you look at the grand scheme of things and if you know history well.
All right. Barakallahu feek. So the next question is, what does pusillanimous mean?
Pusillanimous.
Yes.
It's a word to mean like someone who's timid and cowardly.
Okay.
Yes.
Barakallahu feek.
Yeah, I'm sure you guys could have Googled that one.
So the next question was, did Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam ever sin? And if so, how can he be the best of mankind?
We don't, I mean, the standard view, if you like, the majority of scholars say that prophets don't sin. Okay. Now, Ibn Taymiyyah had this, he had an opinion which was based on his reading of the text, which is that prophets can't commit major sins, but minor sins are possible. I don't know if he extended that to the Prophet Muhammad. I'd have to look at that. But definitely he would cite things like, you know, Adam alayhi salam, you know, where the Quran says, فَأَزَلَّهُمَ الشَّيْطَانِ, you know, that the devil kind of deceived Adam and Eve and so on. And and so on. So he sees, oh, how could they eat from the tree if that wasn't a sin? How could they repent if it wasn't a sin? But the interesting fact is the Quran never says to the Prophet Muhammad to repent. The word istighfar is different. The tawbah is never there. Tawbah is never there. The word tub, or the command or the imperative for the Prophet Muhammad is never there. There is wastaghfir li dhanbik. Astaghfir li dhanbik is istighfar, which is basically asking for forgiveness, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the person has sinned. What would necessarily mean that the person has sinned is tawbah, because tawbah is literally turning back. So the idea is you're turning back to God after you have moved away from him. But God never says to the Prophet Muhammad tub, or, you know, repent or something like that. So my view is that the Prophet Muhammad was infallible. That's my view, that he didn't commit any major or minor sins. But there are some scholars that say, well, you know, minor sins are not as problematic theologically. For the reasons I've aforementioned, I don't think that's necessarily a viable option. But yeah, I think there can be a stronger argument made in that direction by, if you're talking about other prophets, even Moses in Surah Al-Qasas, you know, فَوَكَزَهُ مُوسَى فَقَضَى عَلَيْهِ قَالَ هَذَا مِنْ عَمَلِ الشَّيْطَانِ إِنَّهُ عَدُوٌّ مُضِلٌّ مُبِينٌ. That, you know, that the Prophet Moses had, you know, there was you know, some kind of fight in the streets. He came, he saw his boy was getting battered up, so he, you know, he came in, he gave one bang, one punch in the face, the guy dropped dead. And then Moses said, for, you know, هذا من عمل الشيطان, this is from the doings of the devil. So إنه عدو مضل مبين, so which that he is an enemy attested, and so on. So things like that, you know, you can kind of use to make an argument against other prophets, maybe doing an unintentional sin or a minor sin. But, you know, doing a major sin, I think that's definitely, everyone agrees that's impossible.
Okay. Barakallahu feek. So next question is, how did the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam deal with anxiety and depression?
You know, it's a good question, you know, wallahi. It's a very, very, very good question. I mean, I was having, I've actually never answered this question in public. That's how good it is. And it's, you know, it's a very important one. And really, you have to understand the difference between sadness and anxiety. Okay. And that's an important, you know, clinical difference to make. Now, I'm not claiming to be a psychiatrist, but I've read a lot of stuff about depression because it's such a big deal in the modern discourse. And so from my, you know, cursory reading of the literature, one thing which sticks out in terms of this discussion about anxiety is the difference between clinical anxiety, and transitory sadness. That's an important difference to make, right? So transitory sadness is usually when there's some kind of extraneous variable, some environmental factor that is causing you to act in a way that you would not usually act. Whereas depression is usually, feeling unmotivated, sleepy, and these are the symptoms that usually the kind of DSM manual, if you like, would put forward as the main symptoms. Feeling sleepy, unmotivated, feeling like, the hopeless, it's an extended hopelessness that's not affected by the extraneous variables. So in other words, whatever external things would happen, you'd still feel the same way. So the question of when Allah, he consoles the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, وَلَا تَحْزَنْ عَلَيْهِمْ, and some things like that in the Quran, and don't become sad over them. Is he consoling him because he was depressed? I wouldn't say that it was depression in the clinical sense, and there's nothing to suggest that it is. But definitely sadness is different, and definitely the Prophet underwent long spells in his life where he was sad. For example, in the beginning of the wahi, the revelation, when the revelation first came, and then he didn't have revelation for 6 months, so he felt extremely anxious and sad at that time. And obviously what came after that was Surah Al-Duha, which is a very hopeful kind of surah, Al-Duha wal-Layli idha saja, which is basically, Al-Duha literally means the sunlight. Talking about light at the end of the tunnel. This is literally talking about sunlight and that God has not forsaken you, and it's comforting and therapeutic kind of message that Allah sent to the Prophet. And so in sum, I would say that first of all, you'd have to find out what the difference between what they call clinical anxiety or depression, because quite frankly, anxiety and depression are two sides of the same coin, clinically speaking. And transitory sadness. If you identify that you have anxiety and depression, then all of the spiritual remedies are important. Having a schedule, a daily schedule, is very important. Aligning your life with the 5 prayers, doing the wudu, pondering over the Quran, and all those spiritual activities really will make the difference. However, I would also add that you need to get professional help and try different things. Now, the NHS, for example, in this country, have things in place like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, psychoanalysis, and things like that, and try those things out as well and see how they work for you. Because sometimes it can be a chemical thing, guys. I mean, depression in the Muslim community is not, I've never seen it being the full treatment of it being done properly, because some people have chemical imbalances, and that's my view. People have bipolar disorder. So you have bipolar disorder where you have, spells of mania, hypomania, and then after that you have a depressed state. And you can see the difference in people when they start taking their drugs. Like, I know a person that's close to my life that's bipolar, and they take drugs like quetiapine and so on. And if they don't take those drugs, their attacks of hypomania and so on will be so acute that themselves or kill someone else or be admitted into the mental hospital. So we need to be very careful as to how we advise people with clinical depression. We shouldn't just kind of give a spiritual antidote and that's it. The person that you're talking to might have some serious imbalances in their chemical imbalances in their body, which necessitate that they take tablets. And I'm not against someone taking tablets, because if someone's got chemical imbalances and the only way that they can be resolved is through medicine, it shouldn't be a taboo in the Muslim community that someone is taking that, especially if they're bipolar or if they have, multiple personalities, schizophrenia, or any of those mental health issues. We have to be careful how we advise people that say they have depression. Don't speak down to people, don't arrogate to people, because quite frankly, you don't know what they're going through. You don't know what chemicals are going through their body or what's happening in their life. So, the Prophet said, if you're talking about, clinical issues, من تطبب ولم يكن بالطب معروفا فأصاب نفسا. Somebody is, and it's a hadith which is authentic and it's in Bulugh al-Maram, that if someone acts as a doctor and they are not in the clinical field a specialist, and then they injure someone, then they are accountable for that. So I would say the most powerful thing that the Prophet said about anxiety and depression is that hadith, because he's saying don't try and deal with this. You guys are not diagnosticians. You're not a clinical psychiatrist or someone who can do these things. If someone is saying they got depression, they have to be run through the right parties. That's where your jurisdiction ends. Yeah, you can give them general advice, but don't pretend to know things you don't know. Things can be very serious if you give wrong advice, especially with people like that. And this is something that all imams around the country and all leaders of ISOCs and everybody else should know and be very aware of. Be careful of giving medical advice which you have no authority to give. I think that's probably one of the most important things that needs to be said.
Okay, thank you. Jazakallah khair. So this next question is, why are the aspects of Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's life that are negatively viewed as coming from reliable or false sources, whereas the positive actions, aspects, parts and stuff like that are viewed as coming from reliable, credible sources? Is it only credible if it fits the narrative?
I don't think that's true, because look, for example, we just talked about the hadith of Aisha being 9. I mean, that's hadith narrated authentically in Bukhari, in one of the most authoritative traditions. And some people have tried to, in the modern age, refute this hadith and the authenticity of it. But for the most part, the scholars have not gone down that route. If there was any hadith that needed to be changed to fit a modern narrative, it would be that one, right? Quite frankly, that's not the case. And this is actually the principle of embarrassment is a good one of the major historical ways to prove that something is true. And there's lots of things in the hadith tradition, which even in the Quran, which go like, for example, Abasa wa Tawalla, chapter 80 verse 1, that the Prophet turned around, and Allah is actually rebuking the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is reprimanding him. So obviously it's not a sin because he was unaware that was wrong. Because if someone does something and they're unaware of it, it's different. But still, it was quite, it's quite embarrassing if you think about it. There's a public reprimand. So there's lots of things in the hadith tradition which it would be in the interest, if this was a false prophet, of either the prophet and or the Muslim community to take out of the Quran and Sunnah, but that's clearly not the case. So I actually reject the premise of the question, because most things are positively viewed because they connect to the liberal paradigm, the dominant ethic of the West today. And if they're negatively viewed, it's because they are going against the liberal paradigm, which is we don't believe in liberalism. We don't believe that liberalism as a political philosophy is the truth with a capital T. So for us as Muslims, we don't need to make those concessions or try and change our tradition based on what liberalism dictates.
Okay, thank you. Barakallahu feek. The next question is, are women oppressed in Islam, and what are your reasons for your stance?
I mean, whenever someone talks about oppression, they need to talk about justice first, and they need to have a robust theory of justice. And obviously, if a second wave feminist approaches the Quranic literature, which many of them have, they may conclude that oppression has been done, especially because the Islamic system is not an egalitarian one when it comes to, it's not an absolutely egalitarian one when it comes to men and women in a household. It's more complementarian. And this complementarity of men and women is vehemently rejected in second wave feminist discourse. Especially there's the attacks that have been made on the mother, even the mother, like Simone de Beauvoir and others make it very clear their opinion on the family and the motherhood and all that stuff, and even having children. So all of these things are clearly against the Islamic narrative. But the question is, why should we believe a people that have come in the 1960s and 70s, that their ideas were not fully formalized until, the 20/21st century. And all women of all times almost didn't have exactly that opinion. That's why feminism has had to evolve into third wave, when black women decided that, like bell hooks and others, famous feminists, decided that actually black women are not being represented. And then Kimberly Crenshaw came along and talked about intersectionality. And these intersectionality is the idea of interlocking powers, or as an intersection in the road. And so you're not just a woman, but you're a woman, you're a black woman, and you're a woman of this particular disability, or this whatever it may be. And so the patriarchy narratives have been the patriarchy narratives have been kind of refuted, and ironically refuted by the by feminists themselves, like third wave feminists and others. So yeah, I would say that if it depends on what you're measuring with. We're calling people to measure with Islam. We're saying the barometer of justice is Islam, and we have robust ways of proving that Islam is true. Obviously, for those that are unaware of my work, if you want to see those ways, then you can go on, go online, go on YouTube, and write down, prophecies of Islam, or watch a debate that we've done, or the multiple debates where we try and argue the case for Islam being true. That's different. But the point of the matter is, oppression is only realized when you've already made your mind up on ideology. If you believe that feminism and liberalism are true, and there's no degree of falsity in those ideologies, then you're going to approach the Quran and Sunnah in a way which is going to give you doubts, because you're going to say, well, this doesn't match with this. Either you're going to compromise on integrity in terms of representing one of the two traditions, or you're going to compromise your faith, or even leave it altogether. That's why it's important for someone to question the questioner. Like when someone says, why is it the fact that there's not an exact equality between men and women in Islam, and that women have to wear one dress code and men have to wear another dress code? How can you reason that? We'll say, well, hold on, what is the premise is that equality or equality should mean identicality in rulings. We say that we don't accept that premise. In fact, that premise is flawed. And in fact, I think the premise itself, which Simone de Beauvoir quite clearly stipulates in her book, is that despite the fact that she does realize that we are different physiologically and emotionally and psychologically and so on, that men and women are different psychologically, emotionally and physically and whatever, she realizes all of that, but she says despite those differences, we should still have equality. Now, that's the premise. That's the assumption. And what we need to do is question that premise, question that assumption, and ask why and how. What is the evidence? What is the evidence of that being the case? Why should different things be treated the same? And why should different things be treated the same in the very things that they're different on? That's a very important question. And feminists of the second wave have not been able to answer those questions, I think, in a moment to the Quran with second wave feministic assumptions. You're going to find it difficult to conclude that they're both in line with one another. Oppression, therefore, is defined by its counterpart, which is justice. And justice can only be realized when you have a robust theory of ethics, and you see this is appropriate and this is not appropriate behavior. In Islam, obviously, by definition, everything is just because it claims to be like that. It claims to come from the all-knowing, wise God that cannot have erroneous judgment. And that's why the onus is not on us, and the burden of proof is not on us. It's upon those other people that claim oppression to prove, first of all, why their theory of justice is true.
Thank you. Barakallahu feek.
Yeah.
So the next question is, could you mention some of the proofs that the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was actually in fact a prophet?
Absolutely. So I would say we can compartmentalize these into two. So one of them, I would say, sufficient, and then you have necessary conditions and sufficient conditions in it. Like in logic, you have necessary and sufficient conditions. So when you say necessary conditions, like if these things are not in place, it's very difficult to argue that this man or that this religion is true. For example, I would put in there preservation of the Quran. Now, before I continue, actually, on my website, which is called kbyh.co.uk, I've got a small article which is in like 8 different languages, I think. It's an 8-page article with these, what I'm about to mention, and probably more because we don't have the time to go through all of them, in writing. So if you want to, you can maybe send that to the brothers and sisters that are on this group. And that's something in addition. So in terms of the necessary conditions, I would say that if something is not preserved, such that all humanity can access it after the time of revelation, then there's a problem. Obviously, if you compare it to other, world religions like Christianity, quite frankly, it's very clear that there's different versions of the Bible, that the canons are actually different. You've got 66 books for the Protestant canon, 72 or 73 books for the Catholic canon. Eastern Orthodox have 81. You know, we're talking about different numbers of books within the Bible itself. And then if you're talking about the 27 books of the New Testament, the question is, who is it that determined that these are the books that should be in there? And if you know about patristic studies, we know that in the 4th century, a man called Athanasius decided that, but he did so with no decree. And it wasn't even a council. There was no ecumenical council. So the question is, what is the book that we have and how is it preserved? We have one book, which is the Quran, and we have a very, like I've just mentioned in the beginning of this discussion, a very rigorous system of authenticating narrations. Such a system does not exist in any other religion. So the fact that you have authentication and preservation is, I think, one of the most important necessary conditions for anyone who wants to claim that they are, you know, a universal prophet must have. And unfortunately, that kind of condition is not met. It's not satisfied with other religions, including Christianity and Judaism, for example. Now that's number one. Number two, so this is what I would call a necessary condition. Number two necessary condition is the fact that the Quran has no contradictions in it. The Quran has no contradictions in it, and it actually, this is the only book that I know of, religious book, ancient religious book that says لَوَجَدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا, that if this book was from other than God, then they would have found in it many contradictions. In other words, مفهوم المخالفة, or the intended meaning here is that go and try and find a challenge to find. It's a challenge to find contradictions in the book. You see, the biblical corpus is not like this, because even scholars of the highest eminence, and I'll quote some scholars of the highest eminence, admit that there's contradictions in the Bible. They candidly admit that. In fact, I was reading a book called First Principles by a man called Origen of Alexandria, who's a man who died, I think, somewhere in the mid-3rd century AD. And this is a man who's one of the biggest church writers, ecumenical church writers of all time. And in the back of his book, he describes these verses in the very first page of the Bible. In the very first page of the Bible, which is the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 1, where God says, you know, let there be light, and there's light on the first day. And then on the 4th day, God creates, you know, the luminaries. The luminaries meaning like the sun, the moon, the stars, and so on. And so Origen of Alexandria says, this is impossible to believe in. It's a contradiction. And therefore we have to the text. In other words, we have to look at it in a metaphorical way. We can't look at this literally. And then he complains again, Origen of Alexandria. He said, look, there's a, and this is the Old Testament. He now holds on to the New Testament. He said, there's a verse in Matthew's where Jesus is taken to the top of a very high mountain by the devil, and he tempts him. And a quote, he can see all the nations of the earth. And then Origen of Alexandria, remember he's writing in the 3rd century, where most people maybe believe that the earth was still flat. I mean, lots of people believe the earth was flat. In fact, most of the church fathers did. Yeah. He said, what kind of mountain is this? This is what Origen was, I'm paraphrasing, right? He said, what kind of mountain is this that all of us, how could it be conceivable that all of the nations of the earth are at the foot of this mountain? He said, what kind of thing? You cannot take this seriously. And he even went as far as to say that the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, there's a guy called, I think, Ciro or something like this, who was an antagonist at the time, and he came to Origen, and he asked him, how could it be that your God died on a cross and if he was all powerful? And he said, all these things are metaphorical. So anything that is not logically viable, these individuals have to either call it metaphoric, or they have to try and endure the contradiction. But the fact of the matter is, Islam from the very beginning has challenged people to try and find the contradictions. And this is the point. It's a necessary condition for the fulfillment of prophethood. You can't have a book which claims to be from God, which by the admission of the most the highest scholars of that religion, yeah, is fraught with contradictions, such that now you have things like the documentary hypothesis and other things like that, which say that, you know, the Bible is a combination of things, which doesn't have one fixed author. and so on and so forth. You can check that on your own time. So preservation, the lack of contradictions. But I would say in terms of now sufficient conditions, obviously now it's a probabilistic case. So what would satisfy you to believe? And I would say one of the most powerful things, quite frankly, is the prophecies. Because, and there's a beautiful book which you can download free of charge from the Aisha website called The Forbidden Prophecies. The Forbidden Prophecies, right? Written by a friend of mine called Abu Zakaria. In fact, Abu Zakaria has got a channel and there's a video on it called the most mind-blowing, there's a video called Most Mind-Blowing Prophecies of the Prophet Muhammad. You know, basically how the Prophet predicted things that were coming in the future that no one could have known at that time, and that he says were going to happen. But the Quran and Sunnah does so. Now, obviously, I don't want to take too much time in telling you what those are, but for now, those three things should hopefully act like a springboard for, if you're interested, to look into the sources I've recommended.
All right. Barakallahu feek. So we only have time for one or two more questions. The next question is, what should someone do if they are interested in Islam?
Someone should look at the seerah of the Prophet Muhammad. Like, for example, we said today, The Sealed Nectar is a nice book to read. You know, and someone should look at the Quran and the meanings of it and familiarize themselves with the arguments of Islam. Like I've just mentioned, reading books like the Prophecies and stuff like that. And also immerse themselves, go to the mosque, see how the practice is done, how people pray, how people fast, just to, you know, get in touch with a couple of people who are Muslim. And then after that, it should be a decision that they make, you know. And remember, look, we're not going to live forever. At the end of the day, we could die tomorrow. So we want to be on the right path. So I would say, think about death as well.
Barakallahu feek. The final question is, can you say you're finished, please?
You're finished.
Barakallahu feek. So if you'd like to close up, are there any closing remarks you'd like to give for us?
Not any closing remarks other than those I've already given, like to summarize. You know, it's important that we know the sources. It's important that we know, especially the Quran and the Hadith, but also the life of the Prophet. And because, I mean, if you have a daily routine and a structure that you have on a daily basis where you're going through the Quran and the seerah or something like that, it will, inshallah, accumulate into something very meaningful after a space of time, and you can be firm in your religion, inshallah.
So unfortunately, there were actually a lot more questions which we couldn't answer, but we'll try to answer them on our events or social media page. So follow us on BL ISOC and QM ISOC, and we should be able to answer them, inshallah.
What's BL?
BL.
What's EL? East London.
BL. I think it's Barts London ISOC. Yeah.
Oh right. Okay. That's what they've got. What, they've separated themselves now?
I'm not sure. I'll be honest. I can't speak on this.
I'm only joking. No, I don't remember there being a Barts one. I thought that they were all, you know, back in our days there was just one ISOC.
Yeah, I'm gonna be honest. I don't know. Barakallahu feek. Jazakallah khairan for this.
It's a big controversy, brother. You're trying to hide it. I'm only joking.
Nah, so thank you a lot for this session. I'm sure many people have benefited. Jazakallah khairan. So we've also got many other events coming up, which is so we have Dawah at University and Jesus in Islam coming up. So you guys should definitely stay tuned for those events, inshallah. Jazakallah khairan, barakallahu feek for coming, and I believe that's it. You're free to leave.
Thank you so much.